Please do. Okay, colleagues, we're gonna get started. The idea is if we start on time, we can also finish on time. So while people are just getting coffee outside, please do come in and join the rest of us as we get started with today's agenda. It's actually not my job to welcome you. Our commissioner is going to do that more eloquently than I could ever. Mine is just to introduce myself. My name is Lebogang Molaisi. I'm the Executive Manager for Policy and Research for the Presidential Climate Commission. Previously a commissioner myself, but these days I serve in the engine room, the Secretariat of the Presidential Climate Commission. With that said, I would like to welcome Commissioner Makoma Lekalakala, who's going to give us welcoming and some opening remarks. So a round of applause, please, for Commissioner Makoma.
Dumelang, good morning, Machironi. Good morning and welcome to the second Presidential Climate Commission dialogue on the conceptualization of the Climate Change Response Fund. The Presidential Climate Commission has been tasked with assisting the Department of Fisheries, Forestry and Environment in providing recommendations on what should be considered in the detailed design of this Climate Change Response Fund. South Africa, as we all know, needs to ensure that adjustments in natural and human systems are adequately attuned to the impacts of climate change. It is understood that South Africa has a role to play in reducing global greenhouse gas emissions, and in the country, like many others that have made global commitments which are to be upheld. The most immediate concern on the ground, however, is the urgent requirement for suitable adaptation responses. Over a period of time, we have observed the impacts of extreme events and their devastating effects on the most vulnerable populations, as well as the long-term implications for livelihoods. One of the key risks of climate change is its ability, if not dealt with appropriately, to undermine the country's development objectives. That has given rise to the growing awareness for comprehensive responses to climate change. This awareness is not just fleeting trend, and these interventions require a concerted effort to establish convergence to amass a successful effort to fighting climate change. We're all aware that we now have a Climate Change Act, and this Climate Change Response Fund would need to facilitate and accelerate the implementation of the Climate Change Act, Act 22 of 2024. I think that's one of the recent acts that has been signed off by the President, with a focus on adaptation to progressively strengthen the nation's resilience to climate change. This Climate Change Response Fund must consider public finance, private investment, and other funding partnerships with multilateral and bilateral partners to optimize and scale the resources for available interventions. Given that climate change raises unique challenges to the effective governance as its impact transcends and challenge traditional sectoral governance approaches, the fund must explore the developing of several financial and non-fiscal mechanisms of resource delivery. The fund has to align with the national adaptation strategy and the various sector plans, promote integration of climate change considerations into existing planning instruments, mobilize resources, and reduce vulnerability of populations, including women, children, the elderly, and those economically disadvantaged, those who are in economically disadvantaged situations, ensuring that adaptation measures are equitable and inclusive. Given that this fund could take various approaches in delivering adaptation responses, the aim of this session is to consider the views that stakeholders present today and the views that stakeholders that are present today, and to take this under consideration when developing recommendations to the Department of Fisheries, Forestry and Environment to consider when designing this fund. So I would like to welcome everyone to this session, and we're looking forward to robust discussions and hearing your views as stakeholders in this process. Welcome everyone in the house and also welcoming everyone online. So I'm looking forward to the interventions from both those who are in the room and those that are online. And I would like to hand over back to the facilitator. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to welcome and have some opening remarks that would assist us in taking the discussions forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Commissioner Makoma. I should have mentioned that Commissioner Makoma is also the chair of the Working Group on Adaptation and Resilience, so helping us also to think about how we process recommendations through the Presidential Climate Commission, through the commission process, through the working groups, and how we ultimately land these with either government, hence you see the participation of National Treasury, SALGA, DFFE today, but ultimately landing these with the office of the President himself. All right, colleagues, I'm going to then hand over to Desigan Naidu. When we were planning this session, he was very upset that he couldn't be here, in person, but he is joining us online. Des, I believe you're in Washington, and it's like, what, 25 past 4 o'clock wherever you are? So good morning to you. I'll hand over to you, Des, just to do some of scene setting for the people in the room today. This is the second dialogue, but give everyone a flavor of, where does this process of the conceptualization of the CCRF come from, and how we've basically progressed this from the first dialogue to the second. Thank you very much, Des. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. And it's good to be with you. And I'm sure we're going to have a fairly vibrant discussion today on a critically important topic. And I'm going to offer just a few words of introduction and coax you in a particular direction around the things that we think need a lot more ventilation, a lot more discussion. Recognizing that we have been in a discussion about this for a little while. Many folk who are here have been involved in the more recent processes in the research phase of the CCRF conceptualization, and thank you very much for that. There have been a set of very vibrant discussions and input around it. But the concept itself around climate change funds and mechanisms, financial mechanisms on how to engage climate change have been in discussion for, well, literally decades, actually, in the South African environment. And more recently, it's had a serious leg up in our discussions around the just energy transition, first partnership, and then investment plan. And there is a very vibrant community of practice developing in the South African environment with very important international partners around this. And all of that is excellent. We're now at the point where we need to bake this cake, or at least start baking this cake in a very serious way and make some big decisions on how to move forward. So just a reminder of a few things that you know very well, but it's worth putting it on the table. I mean, first, the rate of climate change has expressed, it's really surprised even the most seasoned pundits. And two things about it have been surprising. I mean, the one is the relationship between the amount of carbon that is in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, and the other greenhouse gases, and the correlation with the increases in temperature. It's not linear. It's starting to look exponential, and the scientists are working really hard around this thing to work out exactly what those trajectories are. And in the not too distant future, I think there are going to be some Nobel Prizes in this direction. And then the other thing that is not a linear correlation is the extent of impact around it. I mean, I'm talking to you from a country which, while it's having a vigorous debate and denialism in some parts around the impact of climate change, there's literally a train of hurricanes that is bashing into the East Coast in particular. And on the one side, you're having this devastation that is a big media topic, and then you flip the channel, and on the other side is the discussion about whether or not climate change is actually real. It's a weird thing. So I think South Africa is in a fairly privileged position around the congruent narratives that we have around it. But this issue about the impact is becoming increasingly intense. I mean, one is the issue around the extreme weather, and we've been engaging the issues around extreme weather for a very long time. But the intensity and the regularity of the intense weather events is going up very, very rapidly. I mean, a major city in the world, in the form of eThekwini, has had 4 flood events that are not unrelated to climate change. I mean, the train of cyclones, as we call them in our part of the world, knocking into the east coast of southern Africa, has contributed very significantly around this. And the sea level warming in particular at this point, later on sea level rise and acidity are going to have their impacts, but in the short term, it's giving a lot of energy to these storm surges, and they're happening with greater and greater intensity. This is also true about the drying events, and you will know that 8 countries just to the north of us have declared what would generally be called a food security emergency. Some of them have appealed very directly, and others are talking about the trends. So these impacts are very real. The other impact that goes along with this, which is the impacts associated with people not being able to eke out a living where they are, or they are physically unsafe, and climate migration is happening. And we are already seeing the beginnings of the potential conflicts and extremism that come on the back of that. So it's happening very, very quickly. And the genesis of the CCRF owes its origins exactly to that. So after this train of events around the country in various ways, and drought and flood conditions seem to be primary in our environment, wildfires not too far behind, the president in his SONA this year, in the last SONA of the 6th administration, put out the concept of a climate change response fund. We need a financial mechanism, and on the back of the financial mechanism, a partnership that is able to have resources available to it that can organize itself to be dispensed in the domain of emergencies, but also in the longer term. Because in the way he reacted to the eThekwini floods, the first 2022 floods, was that in the way we respond to the disaster event, we must build into that rebuild and recovery plan enough that organizes for our climate resilience index to be higher when dealing with the next one and the next one and the next one. Now, in this fourth of four floods to date in that same province, we're already seeing that this isn't actually the case. This is not happening. Just like the 22 flood happened in a climate resilience atmosphere that had, I would argue, a lower index than the one in 2019, and then before that, and before that, and before that, all the way to 1982. So the need to move in a particular direction was put out by the president. And he said, here is an instrument to think about that could organize for us to be in that kind of way. In the seventh administration, in his first budget policy statement in the budget vote, Minister Dion George repeated this, and he added some more words to this concept of the CCRF. He also said that he would make it a priority of the Department of Fishery, Forestry and the Environment to put on the table, in partnership with the other parts of government, of course, most importantly, National Treasury, the concept of the CCRF. And this will probably happen very early in the new financial year to fit in to the budget cycle because there's a replenishment issue. Alongside that, the PCC and its various partners have also been talking to the notion of country platforms. So we have a just energy transition investment plan, and a lot of work has been gone into that, involving the participation of thousands of people in the South African environment and many institutions. We're currently in the process of developing our Just Adaptation and Resilience investment plan under the leadership of the PCC for this phase. The Department of Environment is hard at work around organizing an adaptation investment plan, quite specifically. And this is in partnership with the NDC partnership globally. And all of these are stacking up in a very interesting way. And so the notion of country platforms is becoming increasingly important. How do you organize for an already underfunded climate enterprise? Because climate finance is very low. Globally, it's extremely low in the South African environment. How do you organize to have a coordinated country platform around climate financing so that you don't do absurd things like create a competition between mitigation and adaptation? You don't organize for a competition to be between this enterprise and dealing with issues of loss and damage and disaster management, because you need to have a coordinated approach across all, because all need to organize themselves with higher levels of resourcing, higher effectiveness and implementation of and use of those resources to get us all into a higher resilience index from an impact point of view, but also drive strongly the decarbonization drive inside South Africa, not only for South Africa's benefit, obviously, but for global benefit, and organize for a developing country model of how this investment will organize for you not only to be safer going into tomorrow on the back of existing climate change, because there's already a lot of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but also point to a model of low carbonization that also is congruent with economic prosperity. And it may be that our route to economic prosperity at all, our economic turnaround in the country, is highly dependent on the possibility of a low carbon economy, because our carbon economy has not delivered that. It has delivered very high inequalities in the system. It's created a lot of wealth for some. Some of it stays in the country and a lot of it does not. It hasn't organized for the prosperity model that we wanted when we were talking about the RDP, for example. And so the low carbon economy, a high climate resilient economy, because the adaptation enterprise is a very important building block around the economy, all organize themselves to a possibility that looks very, very promising. So let's talk very briefly about the key pillars of the CCRF. And this has come out in our research phase. It's expressed in the current base paper, the research paper that we have, courtesy of the folk at the UCT Bertha Center that assisted the PCC with this, and all of the other partners that participated. One is the issue around participation, and participation on the supply side. And the president emphasized this point when he made that announcement in SONA. We're not talking about a private sector fund or a public sector fund. We're talking about a genuine participation fund with people holding hands across the spectrum. And that's a core characteristic that we have to strive for. This is from the supply side and organization of the resources available to the fund. It's also about what the beneficiary base of the fund needs to be. The second key characteristic is sustainability. I mean, we're not talking about an event like a pandemic, which is going to go away in a year or two or three. We're talking about a long-term adaptation enterprise just to deal with what is already there and is getting worse. And then a longer-term climate resilience enterprise, because we have to keep this going into the future. Now, the risk registers around the world, whoever does them, even the ones done purely by the private sector, but on the ones that are done by leadership from both the public sector and the private sector and leaders of civil society, are pointing in a very particular direction. And if all those risk registers, some are more famous than others, like the World Economic Forum, the issues of climate change are top of mind. They're top of mind in cabinet meetings. They're top of mind in the workshops that are happening with civil society organizations. They're top of mind of labor organizations. They're certainly top of mind of boardrooms around the world. And so the sustainability of a climate change resilience fund, a response fund, is going to be paramount. The third is that we have to organize for both the design and conceptualization and implementation of the fund to fully realize the just transition framework and those three principles. The principles of procedural justice, the principles of a distributive justice in the benefits of the fund, and of course, we have to organize for the way we respond to climate change. We will be engaging the challenges of our society, and there will be restorative justice, historical restorative justice, but also more recent challenges of inequality and poverty and unemployment inside the system, and they have to be paramount. We also have to organize to have a very good view, a very deep view of the multiple efforts that are happening already inside these domains. The National Treasury has a series of at least 7 projects that we know about, engaging various aspects of this. Some have the label of climate, many do not. And these are really critical. Engaging the issues around reforming our disaster risk financing system is fundamental pillar, absolutely fundamental pillar. Re-looking at the way you engage the grant system, and in particular how money moves from the national to the provincial to the local government level to the point of impact to the theater of operation is critical. Engaging the whole issue around infrastructure finance, because infrastructure is a very core part of the fundamentals of this country's economic future, and organizing for that to be climate resilient is absolutely critical. And there are a series of instruments that are currently operating in all of these spheres, led by National Treasury and its partners engaging this. We can see what's happening inside the DFFE, and it has a very vibrant policy program, I mean, the key of which is the Climate Act. But the policy support, the instrument support for that climate act did not wait for the climate act itself to be passed before the work began. The DFFE has been working now for decades, actually, around the different instruments that the Climate Act now gives us a legislative base to move over the line. And all of those must be synced into, and the narrative of the CCRF must empower all of those in a way that links them together so that the sum of the parts organize themselves for the whole to have a more powerful impact. It's absolutely critical. And this is not restricted to those two government departments. This happens across many other government departments in the South African environment. It is an instrument of our foreign policy. In addition to that, it is something that is key to what's happening in the private sector discussions with the various social partners. And you will know there's a very vibrant, strong NGO, CSO network in the country, which has organized itself to be some of the leading players in the non-state actor environment in the world, actually, around how we engage these issues. And they're all really, really critical. So the fundamental thing that I want to put on the plate for this discussion is that in the way we're thinking about the CCRF, in the way we want to compose those recommendations from the PCC into government so that government gets a leg up on the things that it wants to do and make this really stick. The key thing is that we want this instrument to be very clearly a catalytic instrument for the implementation of the Climate Change Act as a whole. It's a very ambitious piece of legislation. Its narrative goes right across all sectors, all spheres of governance inside the South African system and across all stakeholders. It could be that instrument that organizes itself to do more than organize for the climate resilience of South Africa, do more than organizing ourselves into a low carbon trajectory. It could very well become a primary instrument to have genuine prosperity engaged in the South African system. And hopefully, along with that, the kinds of equity goals that we've been talking about for the longest time, and maybe we can get them into realization. So in the last minute or two that I have, I want to point to 5 issues that I think should be high up in the discussions that you're going to have today, because we want to have commentary on all 5 of these issues and a few others in the recommendations that the PCC makes to the president and to government in the next little while. And the next little while that we're picking is soon from now, actually. We're wanting to do this in the December round, if at all possible, to get enough time available for both Treasury and the Minister of Environment to be able to start the cycle around getting a cabinet decision to then plug into the budget cycle of 2025 so that this can move in the right kind of way. Because the one thing I think there isn't any argument about is that there will be substantive leverage from the fiscus in order to organize for the participation, the financial participation of various other partners outside. So those 5 areas would be: 1, organizing for the focus of the fund. It can't do everything. If it attempts to do everything, it's going to get very little done. So this becomes paramount. So organizing around the focus of the fund and a discussion on the focus of the fund is critical. There's a fair amount of thinking that's gone in and expressed in the background paper, but this is an important discussion to have together. The second is that we have to engage the issues of replenishment mechanisms. Complicated things, obviously. And folk have been engaging this in the climate change domain for quite a while. The one that is currently in global discussion, and it will have a showing in Azerbaijan in about a month from now, is the Loss and Damage Fund and its modalities. And it gives us fair indicators of the things to watch out for, but also fair encouragement about the things we can be ambitious about. The third issue is the disbursement and distribution models. They have to be impactful, and they have to be effective, and they have to be pragmatic. And I'm sure that there's enough competence in the room and online to be able to engage this very meaningfully. The fourth is something that we do have to engage, is that the fund, while it has participation by a very large number of people, does have to be located somewhere. And we're talking about a location in a physical place, but it has to have an institutional location. And that institutional location must be able to empower it with no barriers around its task. And that's never a trivial discussion, because we're talking about having the financial participation of a much wider range of players than we would normally do. So you have to have trust institutions that people can go to, and I'm sure that would be in your discussion. And then finally is the issue of governance. How will this be governed? What is the right kind of governance model that will organize for the highest level of confidence for all of the players, both those involved in the supply side to the fund, as well as those who are going to be part of the beneficiaries of the fund, both primary beneficiaries as well as secondary and tertiary beneficiaries in the system. So those are 5 things that I want to put out there that we would really like to see having serious notes on, at least, and if possible, convergence on, that we can then include into the recommendations document to organize for us to be in the next step. So, colleagues, that's a mouthful that I shared with you. It's a big task. It's a good task. It's a task which, if we get right, will open several doors for not only the climate resilience enterprise, and that's the primary goal, but also, we think, the possibility of socioeconomic prosperity inside the system, so long as we get it right. Thank you very much, Chair. I think I will pause there for now.
Cheers again, and thanks for setting out those key areas for us to take into consideration. Just to check, Des, you're going to stay with us, right?
Not for long, Chair, but for a while, yes.
for a while. Okay.
Yeah, well, there's a job of work to do just now.
All right. I'm going, because I want to do this justice. I'm going to take, I see there's inkling to ask something, and I'm going to do it because Des can't stay for so long. Let's see hands. Don't make me regret this. So it's just one hand. Okay, great. Okay, let's do it like this. Let's do it like this. Before you get into it, even if it's a comment, you introduce yourself and you say which organization you come from, and then we'll take it from there. If it's a comment, great. If it's a question, Des will try and respond.
Des, I don't know if I should say good morning or good night, but hello. My name is Godti Wenofo. I'm a committee member of the SAPS TC 197, which is the SAPS Technical Committee for Green Hydrogens. We're developing codes and standards for green hydrogen in South Africa. Des, may you please repeat the second, you gave us 5 pointers, but the second one you were so fast I wasn't able to get it. You talked about Azerbaijan in that discussion. May you please repeat the second point we need to tackle? Thank you.
Yes, the second one.
Okay, sure. Well, firstly, green hydrogen is a really interesting thing, and a really interesting ambition that South Africa has, and in fact Africa has. And I see on the list of folk that have joined this call, Rob Adam is on it, and Rob is quite center to that, and I'm sure he's going to say some words about it later in the discussion. Very quickly, the points is, one, the focus areas of the CCRF, because we have to be clear about that. 2, the replenishment mechanisms for the fund. That's the number 2 that you were looking at. 3 is the disbursement philosophy and mechanisms of the fund. While you want to give it to absolutely everyone, you got to organize for that everyone is in fact at least a secondary and tertiary beneficiary, but there's a primary beneficiary base that needs to be engaged, and the mechanisms you use around engaging that must be practical and impactful. The fourth point is the issue around the location. Where will the fund actually be in an institution? And the fifth point are the issues of governance.
Thank you very much, Des. Really appreciate that. So Des again will be around in the background. I think for the purposes of progressing through the discussion, we're going to move into the panel discussion. But just to say thank you very much, Des again, for those inputs. I think you've clearly contextualized the issues really well for us. And I think also giving us those agenda points in terms of what we should take into consideration when making our input so that we can adequately give enough meat to the base document so that the colleagues that are working on it can capture recommendations that are centered around these 5 points. I think is very helpful. The thing about innovation, especially in this space, can make us want to do everything all at the same time. And that's not necessarily productive for what we're trying to achieve. So trying to get us to focus on what it is that we're trying to achieve, who we want to cater for in this particular fund, and what the disbursement models must look like is a really important consideration for us moving forward. So thank you very much for that, Des, again. With that said, colleagues, I'm going to move into the panel discussion. So at some point we will get into an engagement, and we're going to have robust discussions. But I think to kind of like provoke some of those discussions, it's good for us to focus our attention now on a panel discussion. I'm going to invite on stage a couple of colleagues to join me up here. So when I call your name, please do come to the front. So from Salga, if I could please ask Rapelani Chikalanke to join me. Yeah, we can give Rapelani a round of applause. And then followed would be Stuart Mangold from the DFFE. Round of applause for Stuart, please. And then from National Treasury, if I could please welcome Kulisang Molukanele. You will correct me. Thank you. And then last but not least, it is Commissioner Makoma Lekalakala, who will also join me up on stage. Please, a round of applause for her as well. Okay. Are we fighting over seats? Okay. All right. I am told you are the experts in this space. You're going to teach me a lot in this session, and you're going to teach a lot of us who are here a lot about this particular fund, and maybe just insights in terms of its optimal location. Desigan did ask us to talk about issues related to institutional location and institutional arrangements, as well as issues pertaining to governance, as also maybe reflecting on the character of the fund. So for me, if it is not responsive to the needs, and if it's not quick to disperse funds, I find it would be counterproductive. I think there's a lot of challenges and inadequacies right now in terms of how we respond to disaster management and disaster relief. I think the eThekwini example is always a thorn in our side because clearly we see what their inefficiencies are. And my just layman's view is that in the development and in the conceptualization of this particular fund, we should be able to address some of those issues. If I am wrong, we say so. We're not afraid to correct one another, even on platforms of this nature. So we're going to start with some introductory inputs from each panel member, and then we'll go into questions after that. So I believe I'm going to start with you, Rapelani. I'll hand over to you then.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I welcome the opportunity to be here today, representing SALGA, to talk about this particular fund, Climate Change Response Fund. It's quite a critical fund for municipalities. Municipalities have been, for the longest of time, requiring some sort of funding for, to respond to climate change, because they are, where the rubber hits the road, and this is where, you directly meet with the communities on the ground. So this fund is going to be much, much critical for municipalities. And I just went straight into it. Just to say, I'm Rabelani. You've already said Rabelani. I'm from SALGA, responsible for climate change, environmental management, and sustainability. So maybe just talking to the areas that Desh spoke about, and then we can go to other specific areas after that. Around the focus of the fund, and I think he was very specific to say it must be a fund that implements the Climate Change Act as a whole. So as he admitted, this is quite ambitious, but it could be a game-changing moment. We need to be, sure as to what the focus will be, because responding to climate change, it's of course adaptation part, but there is the part of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So are we going to focus specifically on the adaptation component, which from what he had articulated is the premise and the departure point for the president in terms of addressing the disasters that have been showing us ugly faces in all throughout the country, in KZN, Western Cape, and all other places. So we would need to be clear as to what that focus will be, so that we can be able to streamline it and be intentional about it as well. So the issue of replenishment of the fund, that's the word that we're trying to look for when you were speaking. It's quite an important one, because we would want a fund that is scalable. And it, more often than not, that is usually a challenge. How do we sustain the funds that we have at a local government level? I mean, municipalities often get support, funding support, but that financial support lacks sustainability. So it's always like a pilot phase. After pilot, everything just falls through the crack. How do we ensure that, we move from pilot to something that is scalable, and programmatic also in nature? So it's something that would need to be looked at. They spoke about the loss and damage fund, and most of those funds that are international funds, they are mostly requiring scale. So we need to think, how best do we ensure, for example, at the municipal level, we get a number of municipalities that are looking at a specific area, be it early warning systems or any other area in the adaptation space that they are looking for, and then be able to programmatically, conceptualize a concept that is, feasible, and also a concept that is bankable going forward. I think that's important. And the bankability in this case is more to ensure that there is a building back better aspects to it. Because I know in the climate change mitigation space, it's more, how do we ensure that you are able to create more profits in terms of what you are doing. If it's renewable energy, the bankers will normally be looking at, is this viable? But in terms of the adaptation space, it's a different one. are we building back better such that when disasters come, we're able to, the infrastructure that we build is able to withstand such challenges that we would have had. So that's quite important for us. And also, the institutionalization of the fund is quite important, and would need to really look at it quite carefully. The challenge that we've been having at municipal level is that structures become cumbersome to access funding, and if you are in a disaster kind of situation, you require funding quite quickly, so that you can be able to address issues the way you need to address. Hence, it's important to even look at the disaster framework itself and overall that and all those are discussions that are going on. But we need efficiency in disbursements of these funds, and also urgency in doing that. And we need to find the right governance model to be able to do that. So in a way, we, as SALGA, we appreciate this fund. We think it's an opportunity for us to meaningfully implement the requirements of the Climate Change Act in a big way going forward. And we are hoping that within the timeframes of the Climate Change Act coming into force, we're able to have this fund, the mechanisms finalized, so that municipalities can be able to tap into that to be able to implement interventions that they require going forward. Thank you so much.
Before you disappear, Rabina, because I see you want to give that mic away very quickly. Very quick there. When a disaster hits, right? You as local government, you are in the coalface of implementation. Nobody's looking at Treasury. Nobody's looking at DFF. It's you, and we require you to act quite quickly. Now, you've touched on the issue of efficiency. How do we go about unlocking those efficiencies? Maybe if you could just quickly give some reflections on that.
Thank you so much. I think the most important issue is for us, what we've realized is the disaster management framework was not working. Sure. It was too slow. There was no clarity as who does what. We are looking at overhauling the whole framework to address issues of efficiency as well in it, because it's within the institutionalization and the structuring of that funding, that efficiency aspects can be looked at. How do we ensure that even though we're ensuring that there is transparency and there's accountability, which municipalities are looking for, we are able to create systems and processes in place, but especially in the municipalities. I'll give you an example. One of municipalities in Eastern Cape who have been experiencing a lot of disasters, bridges being washed away and communities not being able to even attend schools and so on and so forth. And they have been saying to us, you know what, we have been receiving funding from the disaster funds in the country. And as we receive that, we've got a panel of service providers. We have got panel that we already have in place. They have already vetted the processes of getting the panel. Everyone who is there can be able to do their work. And as and when we get such disasters and we get the funding available, we immediately, within 3 months, we're able to ensure that we kickstart the process. Because in many instances in local government, it takes long to get the project going. Sure. The procurement processes, the supply chain management processes really do take long. So if you have got such processes that are streamlined, such that you are able to, within a short space of time, once you get funding available, get proper resources that are able to implement and get things going on the ground. Within a short space of time, you need to get that bridge being built and being built better as well, and be able to monitor the process, because the other challenge is that after you build better, you need to monitor that indeed you manage to build better, because you don't want structures that are not able to withstand the extreme weather events. When the other extreme comes, then it collapses then, because then you lose the gains going forward on that.
Sure. Thank you very much, Robert, and thanks for that, and reflecting on the issue of building back better, because again, it touches on the issue that Des reflected on around the adaptation enterprise, but also the resilient enterprise. So Stuart, it's now your turn. You're going to give your opening reflections, but I think also when you reflect on them, just to take us through, the key mandate of this fund. There are people who are joining us who are not necessarily part of the first dialogue. And a question is going to come up around, why are we focusing on a specific fund that deals with adaptation components? Can't we integrate this into other existing funds? So maybe in your inputs, if you could just quickly reflect on that, Stuart.
Thank you. I can use this one.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Thank you very much, Program Director. Dumelang, Sanibonani, Dimachurun, Molweni. Hope everyone's well on this Friday. And first, before I get started with my intervention, I would just like to appreciate the PCC's convening of this important dialogue. Of course, it's quite timely. You may recall we had one on the 30th of July. At that stage, quite a bit of research was underway on what options we could look at, what recommendations we could make in terms of how this climate change response fund could look, including the question that you've just asked. So since then, we've had what we call a draft recommendations report produced, and I think to a large extent what Mr. Desigan Naidu has provided in terms of the scene setting has covered many of the issues that were raised in the report, as well as some additional perspectives that he's provided. I mean, it's clear that South Africa does need access to scaled up, new, additional, and predictable, fit-for-purpose finance, specifically grant and concessional finance, that can be deployed effectively to create enabling environments for rapid investments by buying down risks and creating new asset classes for clean investments that would allow for more significant and scaled up mobilization and leveraging of public and private finance. That for me really sums up what we really need to do. And I think as Rabalani has said, he's indicated the need and the importance of the issue of access and the disbursement of funding to municipalities. So how would this happen and what kind of model would we look at in terms of the institutional arrangements, the governance structure, to ensure that happens? So for us, I think we're getting to a point where there are a few options on the table on how to proceed. One thing that is emerging is that we probably not going to achieve a big bang approach with this fund, like right away. So there would be a need to look at how could we incrementally grow the climate change response fund. And that could mean in terms of its reach, in terms of its scope, in terms of its funding windows. The issue of loss and damage, of course, is emerging in addition to adaptation, or as a consequence of inadequate adaptation being put in place. And at municipal level, that's a very key issue. At local government level, that's key. At community level and household level, it's absolutely important. We've seen what's been happening within our country and in other places, what the response has been from the insurance industry, and what people and households and businesses are having to deal with in terms of how do you insure your business, your household, your livelihood, your farm against these increasing frequency and scale of climate-related disasters, as Desigan has indicated in his opening remarks. The Durban example is a prime one, but of course in the Eastern Cape, the building of bridges, that's my home province, by the way, so it's special significance. We understand the issue of infrastructure there, and how do we actually scale this up? So we also need to build into this climate change response fund the issue of confidence. Confidence is a very, very important component. We want to make sure that there's confidence across government, industry, the private sector, particularly the donors, the funders, the investors, and of course the beneficiaries, that this process is happening, the disbursements of the funds are happening in an adequate way. And then of course we've got the issue of de-risking. How do we de-risk some of these climate change projects? I mean, I think it's been alluded to that adaptation projects, we know globally, not just here in South Africa, but globally, adaptation projects are the ones that are lagging behind in terms of attracting climate financing. And there's complex reasons for that. But however, almost paradoxically, in Africa and South Africa, adaptation is a key issue for us. It's an absolutely critical issue. And we've got to scale up or find means and vehicles to scale up the availability of financing for adaptation. We've got to sell projects. We've got to develop pipelines of projects. We've got to de-risk them. As I said earlier, we've got to ensure that the business model is sound and can be bankable. We need to be able to monitor and measure the impact related to the adaptation efforts. I mean, as it is, I'm not sure of the exact figures, but National Treasury might have this. If you look at the amount of budget that's allocated to different departments, and you look at it through an adaptation lens, you will see that already the South African government is spending a significant amount on adaptation, even though it might not be called adaptation. But we need to identify those things, and then we need to leverage on them and scale them up and attract private sector financing to really co-fund some of these initiatives. Because adaptation projects are also long-term. They're not responding to a disaster and then try to fix and heal and sort out and manage the situation and get it back to how it was before. Adaptation is a long-term commitment. We need to factor that into the design of the fund and how it's going to respond. The sustainability issue has been raised as well by previous speakers. So let me kind of end there, because I think a lot has been said about the Climate Change Act and how this fund is well positioned to be that financing mechanism for the Act and other issues. And then we need to look at how do we actually attract the financing and what sources, internationally, domestically, private sector, various other sources of funding. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stuart, and thanks for those reflections. Maybe just as an adding on to the insights that you've just raised with us. So ideally you would want to attract private sector funding in a fund of this nature. And I think you've already indicated that, there's challenges related to that, especially considering the long-term nature of these types of projects and their commitments. And the private sector is keen on returns and receiving those returns quickly. So how would you then how would this particular fund go about some of those issues?
Is
Still
that
for
to
you?
me?
Still for you, Stuart?
I'm in the hot seat today, guys, for some reason. Yes, I think this is where we need to get some of the thinking and ideas from this broad range of people here in the room, as well as those online.
Sure.
We want to also hear from the private sector what is it that they would like to see in this fund to inspire them to have the confidence
Sure.
to invest, but also to look at a more longer term or slightly different lens in terms of their investment. This is not about possibly the usual immediate return on investment for the private sector. This is a longer term type of investment that we're looking at. And some of it is linked to the environment and social governance issues, the ESG issues, but not only the ESG issues. If adaptation succeeds, communities are better empowered, their sustainability and livelihoods are increased, their ability to participate in the market is in a better position, their ability to buy goods and open businesses and be part of it would also, a part of the broader economy, would also be given a boost. So it's about framing the investment offering beyond just the immediate return on investment that you would see in a traditional private sector type of investment. And then again, of course, we can be looking at what kind of incentives could be put in place.
Sure.
We need to have a discussion perhaps with the South African Revenue Service about tax incentives for contributing to such a fund by the private sector. It's something we still need to explore, but it's something that we're keeping in the back of our mind, that perhaps that's something we also need to look at. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. I think that's very insightful and something for the colleagues to also think about when they make their interventions. Commissioner Lekalagal, I'm going to go to you then. I think it's quite clear that, households and community members are clear beneficiaries when it comes to this particular fund. If you could maybe reflect and provide perspectives on what are the key barriers to improving adaptation and resilience at community level, as you also give us your remarks and inputs.
Thank you very much. And I think one thing is I would agree with the other panelists that the development of the climate change response funds comes at a time which is opportune, particularly that it's done at a backdrop of the newly signed Climate Act. And this act somehow gives us the legislative framework on really who the responsibilities should be and of the responses that we may have to, for the responses to the situations that we may be facing. I think one is that realizing that the administration or the administering of this fund would be at a local level. So I agree with my colleague there that the municipalities are at the center, but that is something that really needs to be discussed as to how would the municipalities be able to be responsible partly for this response funds, but also whether this response fund would be linked to the disaster management plans. What portion goes for what preparedness funds would be available to respond to whatever situation that may arise, rather than maybe looking at that in the aftermath of what happens on the ground. But the other thing is that we also need to look into that there's different kind of communities or constituencies in the country. We have the rural community and we have the urban community, and there are differences within these communities, and how you respond also is very different. The important part is that I think needs to be also included into this a fund is also to complement what's happening or complement whatever is there. In many communities, particularly in rural communities, people have got their own preparedness plans. They've got their own ways of responding to many other disasters that even at the national level people are not aware of, but they are able to respond and resolve on their own, and they bring up, an environment that would be conducive for all in that area. And we have seen that through the drought-stricken areas. We've seen that also in other parts where there has been flooding, that communities have been able on their own to come up with solutions. So the fund needs to complement what is there on the ground, rather than, and also besides complementing what is there on the ground, also there should be a process of trying to ensure that whatever response comes up, it should be informed by what people would want to see happening, rather than a top-down approach and one-size-fits-all approach, which may not work on many other contexts that we know in the country. The important thing also would be for the fund, what would be the focus of the fund? And that was, what are the funds going to be dispersed for? I think that is, we need to have some sort of a framework, or some sort of a list of, this is what would the fund be dispersed for, and to whom also. That is very important. Is it to the beneficiaries or the affected people directly, or is it just to the municipalities to see what to do about either rebuilding or replenishing, or either trying to come up with how the funds could be used for the community, for the communities to be in a habitable situation. As that's what it informs that, and that's one thing that I like, that the Presidential Climate Commission is doing this consultations or the dialogues, getting views from different stakeholders. This is the second, and I know that there is also some work that is happening in different communities, where there's a reach out to get the views of particular groups to say, there is a climate change response fund, what do you think about it, and how would you like to see that? And communities would be able to give an input based on their experiences with the other funds that they have been exposed to, or that are there out there. So people would be able to give responses to that. I think one thing that, based on your question, is that what are the funds going to be dispersed for, and the duration is quite important also, as to say how much, for how long, and what for, and how do we really monitor and evaluate and hold those that are responsible for the funds accountable, if in case, based on our experiences, we know we can name a lot of funds that have been given for, like building, the Durban example, and I'm not sure who do we hold accountable if anything is not happening. If communities are crying out to say, this is what has been promised to us, and we have not yet had anything. And I know that there's a number of community-based organizations that are online, and they are the ones that have been also discussing and developing. So I'm just very happy that this process is going on, And some of the issues that may not come out on this panel discussion, we may be having them when people are making submissions as to how they would want to see the fund look like.
Thank you, Commissioner Lekaleka. You know, I've read this document, I think the third time now that I'm reading it. And as you're raising issues, it's things that somebody that's sitting in an office that's not necessarily in the community wouldn't think about, around how communities already have their own adaptation mechanisms that actually already work. So it poses the question around, then isn't it a natural response that even at some sort of level around the governance of the fund, there should be community participation? Because they would be able to articulate, you know, what the fund needs to deliver, and especially for community level interventions. I don't know what you would think about that. The nice thing of being facilitator is that I can think out loud and I can tease my questions at will.
I think that would be appropriate, but first it should be sharing information with communities. I know people would say capacity building. No, it's not. We're not capacitating us. If you share information with us, we would be able to do that. And also we could draw from the experiences of the disaster relief organizations. I know they come in, but they also have a process where they would want to check with the centers of power in a community as to what exactly is needed.
Sure.
And I think for this fund also, those would be collating the submissions or the recommendations that would come from different stakeholders, should be in the lookout for that. And also, I think there's so many examples of having an accountable kind of institution or fund, maybe management, and we can have it as same as like we have with the PCC, be a multi-stakeholder, you know, fund management, and that would ensure that ordinary members or someone representing ordinary members of communities would also be part of the management of that fund.
Thank you very much for those inputs. Kulisang, I'm going to move over to you, and I'm sorry I butchered your surname earlier. My sincere apologies. So I mean, you're from the National Treasury, and I think the common thread has been around, you know, you don't have to, you know, recreate the wheel here. You know, there are existing funds that do exist. So maybe just from you, like, how can the CCRF align to efforts such as disaster risk financing already undertaken by the National Treasury?
Yes, thank you very much, facilitator. Yeah, National Treasury has put in place a number of reforms. First, climate change is one of the key reforms. And we also have the disaster risk financing strategy that Treasury has released. And to what my colleagues have alluded to earlier about the disaster risk landscape needing an overhaul. We really realize that as National Treasury, and we have put together this strategy to overhaul the entire system, because we have seen, you know, the impacts of having slow funding to municipalities, not having adequate preparedness and adaptiveness to municipalities, has really yielded zero results and has impacted communities quite greatly. So we see a lot of alignment of the Climate Change Response Fund as well as the disaster risk financing strategy, in the sense that, you know, in three key priorities that I think the first priority has been said by colleagues on the left, on the right, I'm sorry, about, yeah, there's no one on my left, about the need to scale up funding. And not just scaling up funding, but introducing new players or having new players from the private sector be part of this journey, and not having the state to rely solely on the fiscus. I mean, the fiscus, we have seen, can't carry the adaptiveness budget for that are needed at provincial and municipal level, as well as the response. And I think we've seen it in how underfunded disasters have been over the past. So we have this as a core strategy to increase the availability of funding and to scale up the availability of funding. And we see some certain instruments or certain players that can play a role with government in terms of the private sector, which is the insurance industry. So we are engaging with the insurance industry to see how we can scale up the coverage for indemnity insurance to get into public sector infrastructure. We're looking at creation of parametric insurance to really speed up the disbursement of funds to provinces and municipalities and affected areas across the board. The second priority we've also identified is, and I think Des has highlighted it, is to strengthen the disbursement of the funding. We have seen that the conditional grant system, as we know it, has not been really that efficient and effective in how we disperse funding for disasters and climate adaptiveness and preparedness of making sure that infrastructure is resilient to any climate change or any climate-led disaster that may happen. And we need to really strengthen the disbursement methods. The first disbursement method that we are currently reviewing is the conditional grant system. And we are reviewing the conditional grant system taking into consideration the disaster risk financing strategy. So our conditional grants that do response for disasters, our conditional grants that look at infrastructure, building into those infrastructure grants, the preparedness element of infrastructure. So we're looking at, and also various other instruments that we're looking at how best those instruments and alternative financing mechanisms can be built better to address climate-related disasters in that situation. And the last big priority that we see alignment with the Climate Change Response Fund is the need to strengthen data.
Sure.
I think it has been alluded to, what are you dispersing for? And if you don't have the necessary data on the ground, you won't know really what you're dispersing for. And that's a very critical reform that we need to make as stakeholders. Just how can we best collect data and how best can we manage data? Just to give you a brief view of what we're doing right now as National Treasury, on the back of the strategy, is we having a survey with multiple municipalities just to find out how they use their sources of funding when it comes to disaster. And from collecting this data from municipalities, then we're able to see and map out the different risk or the different types of financial instruments that can be used to disperse the funding in a more effective way. So strengthening data is a critical first key element that we need to do in any fund, whether it's the loss and damage fund, climate change response fund, and any other fund that might come into the fray. If we don't have a very stable database and a well-managed database, then we won't know where the money is going and how we can best channel that money. I'd like to touch on something that, a question that you asked my colleague Stuart earlier. I'm sorry if I'm going to hijack this, because how best can we get investors into the room and into something that we've also seen that we need to have a very core strategy as a national government on how we get investors into the room. How do we make investors more comfortable and confident that in whichever and however money that they give to us is being spent adequately. So in the disaster risk financing strategy, we have highlighted a couple of strategies. The first strategy is to have increased collaboration with the financial sector. Collaboration that means co-creating these instruments. These instruments should be just top-down instruments, but really having them in the room, how best can we create this instrument? And collaborating with the private sector in a sense of keeping abreast of any new financial mechanism that might be on the table that can be used. So collaboration is key. Transparency in terms of, as I said, data, knowing how the money is spent, where the money is going, is very critical in having that kind of transparency with the private sector, and makes them very comfortable knowing where the money is actually being spent. We also have seen that we need to collaborate in terms of the financial sector, in terms of how best can we make the regulatory and legislative environment more enabling for private sector innovation. Whether you're looking at several instruments, parametric insurance, CAT bonds, or catastrophe bonds as they call them, how best can we make those things and allow the private sector to innovate and respond adequately to the challenges that we may have. There's also a need to map out the risks that are involved in the entire climate change and be able to cost them, and being transparent with the private sector as well, to say this is how we mapped out the risk of climate change and disasters and the like, so that they themselves can identify how best can we create a particular instrument that really talks to the risks that are there, or for them to make better decisions on, would I want to invest in such a thing? Do I have enough information to invest in such a thing? So those are the critical strategies that we have seen that are needed to really boost investor confidence if we want them to get into the room. And I must speak to the various instruments, because I think it was highlighted earlier what are the instruments that could be availed, either through the Climate Change Response Fund or through National Treasury policies and things of that nature. We have highlighted, and we do know of a couple of instruments that have been conceptualized and implemented. Some of the instruments are at conceptual stage. Like I mentioned earlier, an instrument that could be used very easily is the grant system. And as I said, we are reviewing the grant system to make it more effective. So that's an instrument on how quickly you can get money to provincial and local municipalities. We do have concessional financing as an instrument. National Treasury does have a program that has already brought together international development finance institutes on a concessional financing basis, and the financing is linked to outputs for sector policies or for national policy as a whole. So that's a vehicle that we can use to deploy capital or attract capital rather. And we have seen non-concessional financing, as Stuart mentioned, ESG loans, sustainable loans, green bonds. We do have a green finance taxonomy that highlights a couple of financial instruments that could be used. A framework is being developed at a national level for green bonds, but we know that municipalities have moved a little bit faster than national on that, in terms of Cape Town and Johannesburg already having issued green bonds. So that's something that could be, we can emphasize to them to issue more in terms of having the investments targeted towards sustainability. And at a local government level, we have the updated municipal borrowing policy framework that has been adopted by Cabinet. And in that framework, it highlights a number of financing instruments, from triple Ps to project financing, that could be used or utilized. Because in general, these are meant to finance infrastructure development. And we need to use them to say, okay, in you financing your infrastructure development, how can we add on build better principle in those financing mechanisms? So in a nutshell, that's where we see alignment, and that's where we see certain things that could be strengthened as we collaborate at a national level to basically sing from one hymn book. And if we can do that, then I think we can be very efficient in how we utilize this funding going forward. Thanks.
Yo, Kulisang, it's like the way you've said it, it sounds so easy. Like, yeah, we don't need this session. You have solved it. But I'm guessing it's easier said than done. We need to put the various mechanisms in place in the system to kind of move forward. And it's at various spheres of government. It's a multi-stakeholder process. It's how you leverage, private investment, how you leverage international funding, concessional funding as well, and grant funding. So you're very eloquent, but I think the proviso there is, we need to put the systems in place in order to be able to do this. Stuart asked a question earlier that I want you to maybe briefly respond to before I open to the audience. This question around de-risking adaptation projects. I just want to understand, has National Treasury applied their minds on this so that we can get some reflections as to like how best to de-risk adaptation projects?
Yeah, I'll be very. The best way we've seen how to de-risk adaptation projects through a blended financing approach, right? We do have a grant system in place, and we have put conditions within. So the grant system is largely focused on infrastructure projects, especially at a local government level. And we have put in various, whether it's housing, whether it's water, whether it's electricity, we have put in place measures of conditions to say that municipalities should really have adaptation plans and working towards a build better approach. And we have said to municipalities, you can use grants, to go to the private sector. You can use grants and use this grant as a de-risking mechanism so that when a private financier sees a particular project being a little bit too risky, you can use this grant in a blended way to attract that private sector financier. We've also have workshopped with municipality. You don't in using these grants to de-risk adaptation projects, and I think it was alluded to earlier that the type of investors you'll need that understand the type of projects that you're trying to implement and have the patience to go with you through this thing. We have said trying to encourage municipalities, when you think of when you borrow from the market, you don't have to just go to a commercial bank. You can go to, you have patient capital, you have international organizations, you have international DFIs that understand, that could give on top of the grant that you can use to de-risk, they can actually give a grant to de-risk the project even further, and then you can go to your commercial actors. So in a sense of how we've seen it as a Treasury, especially within the local government space, is one within the conditional grant space, put together very firm conditions for adaptation in infrastructure projects. And secondly, encouraging municipalities to look at other sources of funding other than commercial banks, your DFIs, international DFIs, your domestic DFIs and DBSA. They've been doing a lot of work in trying to have adaptation projects going on and financing adaptation projects. So those in a blended financing way. So what we're trying to give to municipalities is really use all these sources of funding in a blended approach. Easier said than done. We just do the policy work and do a lot of the groundwork, but it does need bankable projects. That's one thing that we say to municipalities, have these bankable projects, invest in that, and the money will follow.
Thank you very much for that. And I think the credit to this process is that through the conceptualization and through the other sort of building blocks of this process that are emanating, and we'll probably also get more from the floor when we open up for questions, is that I think we're on the right track. I think we're talking to the right people are in the room, so we're definitely on the right track to achieve that. Colleagues, this is the part where we engage with the panel, either through asking questions yourself to the panel, and if you're going to do that, I ask you to direct it specifically to a particular panelist, or to provide reflections and comments that can also assist us, especially in terms of those five priorities that Desigan alluded to in the beginning of the session when he was outlining the strategic context for this particular discussion. So by show of hands, if there are any questions. Okay, so I see a couple. I'm going to start. Which is good. I mean, we came here to talk, so it's fine. I'm going to start with you, and I'm just saying, I'm not ignoring the questions that are online. We will get to them. It will work out better if you raise your hand in the chat and we open up so that you're able to speak. But let's deal with what's in the room first, and then we'll go to whoever is online. So I'm going to start with table number 1 there. Yuri, if you can go first.
Thanks, Chair. My question is directed at Rabelane, but I think that maybe Stuart can also help to some extent. So my concern lies, it's a broader concern than the topic we are speaking about, and it lies at a local government level. When we released our State of Climate Action report earlier this year, one of the major findings was the systemic and structural issues at a local government level. And financial resources were just one part of a much broader problem. So for me, throwing money at the problem is not necessarily going to solve the problems at a local government level. We've seen that time and time again. Even the AG's various reports have shown, mismanagement at a local level, and not always at the fault of local government departments, because there is a lack of support, there is a lack of skills and training and so forth. So, and COCTA is often missing from these conversations. So for me, I want to ask, how are we going to deal with the systemic and structural issues to ensure that we achieve what we want to through the loss and damage fund? Because I think if we don't, climate responses will be largely hindered by larger forces than, just climate change. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Yuri. I'm going to come to this table, just indicate. Okay, if the first person can go ahead and ask.
Wow. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tinjalo Makubele from the civil society and cooperatives and the farms. It's quite an eye-opening for us to participate. I just feel there are quite few spaces in front that are lacking the representation of the civil society and the communities that are affected by the impact of climate change. So as we move with the dialogue, I feel we need to increase the front and make sure that we have a full representation. It sounds very much high level. It sounds more on a policy than on a practical. It sounds like it's up there. We need to bring it down. I've picked up a few issues, which are the issue of data collection and the issue of early warning systems, and community participation, which I feel is very, very important. For us to realize all these beautiful policy frameworks that we are articulating, it will be good to make sure that that space is covered and it brings the core issues that are the people that are affected by the torrential or rough climate that we are in. But we are excited to have this kind of an institution or a dialogue where we expand and look at it. I think we need to look into access to information, the kind of information that we need to take into the ground. Like, I'm a farmer, I'm working with plus minus 100 women and youth in the farm who are ravaged by climate change. But we don't know what to do, trust me. We don't know how, we don't know what, we don't know where. I hear the municipality. The challenge that we see is that the municipality become too desperate when there is disaster to say, where do we start? Do we start with the road? Do we start with saving the life? Do we start with putting people in the hall? And some are even forgotten in those halls. Those are the issues for another day. But my take here is that let's take the dialogue to the community
Sure.
and make sure that we have more information and have more awareness. So we are here to support you as our government and as our other stakeholders, but use us as the civil society to take information into the ground, to collect the data you are looking for, and to start to look into the early warning systems and even to identify what is it that we call disaster. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Tinsol. I'm going to move to the next person at the table.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. My name is Lebohang Dita. It's related to two issues that Mama, I think, Likalakal raised. Thank you. You mentioned context, which I think is key. A lot of the times when we see disasters, we know that neighbors are the first responders. What are we doing? What will we do in the fund to make sure that communities, much related to the previous point, are empowered and are able to access the fund so that typically in South Africa, we're good at catering for big ticket items,
Sure.
making sure infrastructure is resilient. How do we make communities resilient? Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Lebogang. It must be a Lebogang thing because you kind of read my mind there. I'll move on to the next person.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Simeon Manamela. I'm from Liberty, but I came here in my own personal capacity. First, let me express my gratitude to you, Program Director, and the insights, eye-opening insights from the panel. My question goes to, let's say, the gentleman from Treasury. South Africa is faced with fiscal constraint. That is true. And the country is about to assume the presidency for G20. How are you looking forward to take the opportunity for such event? Role to attract investment for climate change fund. And my second question, it will be, we know the ineptitude of the government officials. Not everyone, don't get me wrong.
Careful.
We wouldn't say how prepared are they. Like my worry is that I feel like some of the municipalities are still incapable of responding to climate change. And to answer to additional to what my colleague says, there's still need for public outreach, education. Some people, they don't know the consequences of climate change. Yesterday, even though I was a little bit late, I was watching the president's Q&A session, and my question was like, why there's no question from opposition party to ask the president how the GNUs respond to climate change? Like, are we doing that? We don't, the sense of agency. I appreciate, thank you.
Thank you very much, Simeon. I'm going to go to, the list is growing. I'm going to go to the table at the back there and get some insights. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Program Facilitator, and the PCC for facilitating this dialogue session. I think it's really encouraging to know that at a very conceptual stage, at the very inception stage, that you're actually involving input into the process. So I just want to share some of my reflections on what I've heard so far. I think for me, what's really encouraging is to know that there's a willingness to accept that economic prosperity, especially addressing the economic issues in the country, is critical. And when we talk about climate change and the response to climate change, we need to focus on how do we ensure that people in the country benefit from it economically as well. It's very encouraging to know that. But I want to say that a key component of that has to be around economic diversification.
Sure.
How do we ensure that when we start closing certain industries that contribute to a high carbon economy, that we replace them with sectors of the economy that can contribute towards a low carbon economy? And to this extent, I want to talk a little bit about tourism, because that's where my experience comes from. And I think that, if you look at people traveling, globally. They contribute towards climate change. Now, how do we ensure that when we create funding opportunities like this, that even when we start talking about the tourism industry, how do we get them conscientized about practicing more responsible ways of their businesses and things like that? So I think, you know, the point was made earlier, you have these various funds around, but I think if you start going into some of these funds, you'll see that there are gaps there. And for me, I think it's important that when you're starting to create a fund like that, that you actually address those gaps, you know, and you say, what are those funds lacking that this fund can contribute towards in enhancing, and again, the tourism industry. A second point that I want to raise is around the issue of how do you sustain this fund going forward? And for me, revenue generation is going to be critical. It's not only about going to the private sector and say, guys, contribute towards this fund. I think it's also about saying the businesses or the projects that you are funding, how do those businesses generate revenue that can go back into sustaining this fund? You know, I think that's going to be very important. And then the third issue is one of the issues we've picked up working in the industry, especially with funds like this, is that there's a lack of funding for the packaging. And when I talk about packaging, it's about coming up with really bankable feasibility studies that shows that before you actually disperse this fund, that project is going to be commercially viable or sustainable in the future. Now, there's a lack of funding around that, you know, and I think it's incumbent upon this fund to actually create or make provision for that type of assistance that you're going to give. So it's not just about dispersing funds for actual projects, but it's also about dispersing funds for the packaging of these projects. It's definitely lacking in a lot of the funds that we have available. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You forgot to introduce yourself.
Sorry, my name is Sugen Pillay. I'm from a company called BuzzHelp.
Thank you very much. The next person at the table, please. Yeah, next person at the table.
Thanks. Etienne Roberts from Renew-E. My question is to National Treasury. This adaptation and these changes are going to require money. Now, I'm just concerned that South Africa is incurring debt or concessional debt to do this transition. And in my mind, it's just another form of colonialism, in that previously it was taking slaves and taking our resources and the awful things associated with that. And now it's really colonialism in the form of financial colonialism, in that we will incur money to solve the greenhouse gas issues which the global north caused in the first place, and we're going to incur debt, and we have to repay that debt sometime in the future. So we spoke about the financial constraints we have, but what are we going to do about it? Because we don't have the money. The global north is not giving us grants to decarbonize. And I'd just like to understand, well, what can we do about it?
Sure.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Next person at the table, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Lopakwe from a company called New Age Holdings. I would have a lot of questions, but I'm going to try and keep it to a bare minimum. I think in engaging around issues of funding, I think it's important that we don't find ourselves in the same situation with a lot of funds in this country, where it becomes a white elephant, and where fundamentally all the money goes into administrative purposes instead of where it's supposed to go. So we have to, it's very important that, for example, we talk about issues of preparedness, because we have to be prepared in advance. We can't be waiting for the disaster and then only think about disbursing the funds. So what mechanisms we put in place for preparedness become very important in advance, to be able to say, listen, we saw what happened with when it was snowing in KZN, where people were stuck on the freeway. Those are kind of situations that could have been avoided if we were prepared in advance, if we had early warning systems that can ensure that people are not on the roads at that time, so that we end up with a disaster afterwards. So preparedness becomes an important aspect of it. But also, when we're going to build this kind of infrastructure, red tape is very important. I mean, the Treasury, eloquently, as you said, tells us about this one weird and wonderful, systems in place. But when it comes down to it, there's always these red tapes that make it almost impossible to access these funds. And a lot of the time, even the municipalities don't know how to go around these red tapes.
Sure.
And that's why you find that it takes a whole lot of time and processing. And by the time municipalities are prepared to disperse funding, the red tape has stopped the process. So, and then my last comment is on community and SMME participation in private sector. I think a lot of the time when you talk about green energy funding, we tend to focus quite a lot on corporates and international big players. But we tend to forget that participation from SMMEs, for example, is probably the most important aspect of it. And these are the people that we're supposed to make this access to this funding even easier, because they are on the ground, they service the communities, and yet we tend to rely on the corporates who are literally. So what kind of infrastructures do we put in place for SMMEs? When you talk about SARS and tax rebates and all these other kind of things, we tend to focus on corporates, but we forget the guys who bear the pain at the end of the day and who are more efficient in terms of trying to get solutions into this place. So how do we then ensure that this fund is geared towards improving their efficiencies?
Thank you very much, Sol. I can see my panelists are furiously writing down, and they no longer have paper left. So in your inputs, just bear that in mind for me, please. Next person at the table.
Thank you very much for the discussions and for PPC for putting this together. This is really, it's coming at the right time, with the changes in government. Oh, by the way, morning. My name is Christo Morolong. I'm in property development, but I'm putting a solar farm together in the Western Cape, So yeah, I'm a sustainability evangelist, if I can put it that way. It's something very close to my heart, I think the first question that the lady first speaker raised in terms of SALGA, yeah, as much as I trust local government, but with politicians and officials, it's if you look at the AG reports, most municipalities don't even. I mean, it's a disaster there. So, if I had my powers in my way, I would say, look, let's rather house the fund, maybe at national cocktail level, and have implementation partners like your civil society, like your caregivers. I mean, this care of the caregivers. I would rather give them the money to run with that, because I know I can trust them, and they've done work quite well. I mean, we've seen with the floods and everything. And your civil societies, like Mama was saying there, they are the people. I mean, and women are mostly affected by this, and children, like any wars, Climate change affects women and children mostly, more than any other thing, So I'll rather have implementation partners, like your caregivers, spending the funds, because they are at the coal face of that, Yeah, the other thing that probably the money's there. I don't think we've got a problem in South Africa with finance. We don't even have to go outside. Money's there. It's just there, I mean, and I'm glad that we've got Liberty here, I mean, we've got pension, I mean, asset managers, GSE asset managers who definitely like to invest in this. Whether the return, yes, we can look at the packaging and look at the returns for them, because, I mean, business always look returns for their shareholders. Asset managers, pension funds, they're sitting with a whole lot of, I know there's been a strike, investors striking, not wanting to put their money into public programs. But I think at where the GNE is going, there's some sort of confidence in the business to say, I think now we can release some money. Yeah, I think those are my just comments and questions. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Christo. So I'm moving to this table. We can start anywhere.
Good morning. My name is Masha Moyana. I'm a freelance journalist. And my question is directed at Commissioner Lekalakala. And I think it also supports some of the comments that have been made around communities and how they'll be benefiting from this. But mine comes on the language that is used when you engage with communities. I mean, we're talking about adaptation, we're talking about early warning systems and all this seemingly high level and sometimes scientific terms that ordinary people might not even know what they mean, even though she does mention that communities have the solutions. So my question is on what is being done to ensure that even in that communication, when we talk about maybe extreme weather conditions and describing a level 6 storm, how do you translate that to ensure that the communities that are affected know and understand the possible impact that might come from that early warning, for instance? And even when we talk about adaptation, what does that mean on a local level? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next person from the table.
Thank you. The name is Nakolo Mthembu from Gauteng Infrastructure Financing Agency. On the different mechanisms that we already have, and I think a colleague from National Treasury started to touch on one of them, which is a triple P mechanism. It's a de-risked kind of financing mechanism. It's easier that for private sector to participate in this manner. There is a benefit to the extent that municipal infrastructure is concerned and its vulnerability to the effects that we're talking about, that you have an opportunity to use this very mechanism to then employ the fund, number one, as a capitalizer of that particular transaction or project. But also, what makes it easier is to monitor that long-term effect. The advantage is the tenure of a triple P project that allows you to say, in the last 10 years, this is what we've experienced, this is what we've noticed in the resilience of the infrastructure, and we can then change to that. That's the beauty of crafting a transaction based on this triple P model, where private sector brings in the finance, they will arrange their own finance, we give a capital contribution as government. And my place of implementation at this point is public infrastructure. We think public infrastructure is free. It is not free. We pay for it in rates and taxes, therefore there is a benefit, there is a return to upkeeping that particular portion of infrastructure. I think that's my comment at this point. National Treasury, again, we're not, I don't think it's sustainable to keep giving the grants. The diagnostics clearly indicates 23% of your funding of grants goes to, of municipal revenue is in grants. Sure. That is not sustainable. They collect monies from equitable share from the National Treasury, but also we cannot then say we must just feed off grants. Grants don't replenish themselves. Our municipal infrastructure has an opportunity to replenish themselves. It becomes a believable story then in the triple P model to say, I, as the private sector, am able to invest in such a project because I have a return. And like you say, if we employ incentive mechanisms from SARS, they're able to get discounts on those returns or incentives for those returns. I have no question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate that. If there could be more comments than questions, I'd really appreciate it. Is there anybody else from this table, or can we move on? Kwezi.
Thanks, thanks, colleagues. So I wanted to just speak to Kolisang, I think, from the National Treasury. He raised a point on the lack of, I guess, data that's readily available that sort of informs policy decisions and, I guess, allocation of capital as well. And I just wanted to find out where National Treasury is in terms of climate budget tagging, because I think that would be sort of like a key intervention in us ascertaining where we are currently spending our public finance and also informing how we go forward to sort of see where the gaps are and see where to allocate capital going forward in terms of adaptation and resilience. And then just maybe like a last comment, just on the different financial instruments that were mentioned. I think there's a lot of focus on, the leveraging of commercial or private sector capital, and I think we've seen sort of like globally that there isn't a lot that has come from private sector capital into adaptation. I think around 80% of adaptation finance globally comes from, development finance institutions. And I'm wondering if, as South Africa, in the conversation where we're starting to talk about, the blending of finance, we aren't missing a critical sort of opportunity to really focus our efforts on encouraging the mandates of DFIs to sort of change and encourage them to focus on this hard to finance sector of adaptation and resilience, and really just creating an environment, an enabling environment in that ecosystem to drive some of these sustainable finance efforts that the National Treasury colleague spoke to. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kwesi. I just want to check so we're going to start with you, Richard, and then we'll see how many people also want to speak from that table.
Thank you, Comrade Chair. My name is Richard Worthington. I work with civil society. I'm associate to Project 90 by 2030. This is a question for National Treasury, but I'm not expecting the official delegated to this dialogue to answer it on the spot. It's a bigger challenge. So this discussion has been going on since at least 2008, when we started to work on the National Climate Change Response Policy. And there were questions about, should we be designing into this policy a funding mechanism? The approach was mainstreaming. This was carried through in the policy white paper of 2011. Mainstreaming climate change response into everything we do, including National Treasury and budgeting. Now here we sit 13 years after the adoption of that white paper, and we're trying to figure out how to put a fund together, partly because that mainstreaming hasn't happened. And so I think it behoves Treasury to communicate with the people of this nation about how it is responding to climate change, not just through this fund. That's the context for raising the question about, to what extent is this an add-on to the mainstreaming of climate change response in all that government does, and to what extent is it trying to fill a whole lot of gaps which actually need to be addressed in their own right. So, disaster response, there's a responsibility to provide for that anyway. My understanding of this fund was maybe it'll help us to make those disaster response mechanisms work better, because we know this stuff, so there's work to be done. But then I hear all of the different aspirations for this fund, and I start, oh my Lord, is this going to be it? Now everybody's going to expect this fund to do it? So that, to my mind, is a question which kind of goes it's a bit broader than the questions that, I mean, Deskin mentioned it as focus of the fund, but So I think there also needs to be some discussion of what this fund is not expected to do, and we expect to be addressed by other means. And this is particularly pertinent to local government. It has been long advocated by Salga and others that we need reform of the municipal financing model, how that works. This has come up in relation to access to energy and other basic services. And so, there isn't anything that goes on in our society that isn't related to climate change. So one can always make a climate change pitch for just about anything, because things are so interrelated. And if we're only asking what should we focus on, you have different contending issues of focus. I think Treasury needs to think about being clear and communicating what it is doing in terms of mainstreaming climate change response to help this fund to be able to be responsive to communities, to have community participation in all of these different, not everything, but certainly in the governance and in the way that the existence of this fund is communicated. So, because otherwise there's a risk that going out to communities and trying to explain to them that they might also perceive this is it. This is how we engage with climate change. This one fund. And Treasury needs to be telling us what they're doing in these discussions about reviewing the conditional grants. I mean, for a long time we've been asking Treasury to enforce more accountability for the money that goes into free basic electricity, because we know that maybe 20% of it actually achieves what it's paid out to achieve. So this is not a new request. I do think that the question of the role of local government, well, the relationship of this fund to local government shortcomings generally. Local integrated development planning, this has not been systematically adopted. Is there going to be work done on that, possibly under the auspices of the National Planning Commission? We haven't heard much from them, but I understand they exist. We've also got a department in the Presidency of Planning, Monitoring, and Evaluation. So those people are working on things that overlap with what this fund aspires to do. It would be good to hear from those departments how they relate to this, and also we'll be looking at not having this just trying to make up for deficiencies elsewhere, which should be addressed in their own right. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'll take your question. Yeah, and we're under pressure for time, so.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Thank you. I'm Mahendran Manikam. I'm a member of the Consulting Engineers of South Africa, and I think mine will be more on infrastructure. I think just a very brief comment. If you look at how we can sustain the fund and go hand in hand with the Climate Change Act is about how we set targets. Now, I think the Climate Change Act is very clear on target setting, sectorial target setting. I haven't seen it coming out as yet. And then with that, as Rudazani said, when we implement projects at a program level and then at a project level, we first need to understand what are the stresses that are going to affect a region through data analytics, and then how does the project contribute towards decarbonization, and how do we then look at how we contributing globally towards the 2030 target, and then overall to the 2050 target towards, I mean, we're never going to get to net zero, but towards a decarbonization. So just to understand that, I think if we set those targets and then we have a criteria for issuing the fund, be it at a national level or a provincial or local level, then against that set criteria and showing how we can contribute to decarbonization, I think that would be the way to go. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those comments, Mahendra. I'm going to move on. We're not going to have space to respond to everything, but yeah, let's move on.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks. My name is Edwin Mameja. I'm from the Nkangala District Municipality. I'm just going to be quick. I think mine goes to Rabelani. I know the lack of capacity in municipalities is often cited as a hindrance when it comes to implementing climate actions. And then I know that SALGA had embarked on a process to do your gap analysis or need analysis in local government. So I just want to check with Rabelani, what did you find through that initiative, and what are the plans going forward in terms of strengthening capacity in local government to implement climate action? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I have the next question, please?
Thank you so much. I'm Irene Mtombwa Shumba from the South African Red Cross. My question relates to the former speaker, especially on enhancing local capacities, especially now relating to climate change. But then we also need to look into how best then can we maximize on collaborations especially with looking into the climate change response fund, so that at least we don't have fragmented interventions around it. How best can we enhance collaboration and ensuring also fair access of the funds, by everyone involved. Yeah.
Sure, I'm taking one last question and then we're going to the panel. Sure. Yeah, we're gonna do responses and then we're gonna come back to the online audience.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Once again, my name is Godswill. I'm a committee member for South Africa for SABS TC 197. Mine are comments, so no need to stress yourselves. So, firstly, in line with data collection, data analysis, data management, we need to think about developing a centralized data center to be able to manage all of this data collected, not just data collected from research, but also data collected from local communities, and also for best practices internationally, because there are other countries that are implementing what we want to implement, and we need to learn from them the best way forward, instead of experimenting. And in doing that, in creating a centralized data center, we also need to make sure that some parts of those data are not in silos. When I say in silos, when you come to, yes, there's a data center, which is an organization, but within that organization, there are departments fighting themselves with a tug war, or even how to explain it. And that often slows down process. So we need to have a way to eliminate that. And if possible, also look at how we build AI models that are able to predict, disasters that are coming or other variables we need to predict. So there is one. Coming into fundraising, a lot have been said about how we can fundraise for the fund. Rightfully, we talk about incentives and tech breaks. And the gentleman at the back here touched on one particular point. So I come from a private equity background. There's a lot of international funds that have satellite offices in South Africa. South Africa is a gateway to Africa, right? And it helps me remember something called a Section J12 investment scheme we had back in the day. If we had something like that for investment funds to say, like for a better word, taxes can actually not be taxed but be invested in more risky projects when we're looking at climate finance. That is one way we can go. Now, I wasn't here for the first discussion, so I don't really know the mandate of this fund, but I believe is to respond to disasters. When we're looking at responding to disasters, obviously, it's right from this education, skills development is a key factor. But we also need to look at not just prevention models, but how do we commercialize opportunities that come from disasters, right? So, for example, let's say we have a landslide, and a landslide is shift the topography of the whole area by a certain meter. How do we turn that to, how will I say, a theme park or whatever we can out of it, right? Now, management of the fund. I rightly advocate that we should actually look at a commercial philanthropic model. So what I mean by that is why we have a fund to respond to disasters. We actually have to have a commercial arm that rightfully produces income for the fund and then can be channeled back to philanthropic activities. And in that being said, I don't know, but PCC has to be clear whether the fund will be structured around a normal fund, which means will it have a term limit, or will there be multiple funds within the whole organization? For example, will it be 10 years? What are the targets? And also, what are the specific sectors that are being targeted? I know it's not a commercial fund, but what I mean sectors, I mean like, are you guys looking at infrastructure alone? Are you looking at humanitarian needs? All of that need to be addressed to be able to attract private sector financing. But private sector always looks at where they can make more money or incentives are, rightfully pointed out. And the last point is we actually need to streamline, because climate change and sustainability is broad. We need to understand what are we actually targeting, right? So are we targeting being able to respond quickly to climate reactions, Or are we targeting being able to train people to prevent climate disasters? What are we exactly targeting? We need to have those lists of targets to be able to measure them properly and also to be able to effectively, how will I say, tackle them. So that is my contributions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gazwa. I'm going to come back to the panelists. That was a lot of information, but here's the thing. So we're still developing, recommendations for the fund. Mandy and team are busy. And what also comes up is that other issues are issues to further unpack as we further craft the document and craft those recommendations. But if you can pick up on some of the issues that were raised in this session that you'd like to respond to, I'll hand back to yourselves. You don't have a lot of time to respond to them, but I just wanna pick your minds in terms of initial responses to the questions that are in the room. So we're gonna get the Salga opinion first, because there was a lot of questions around capacity of the municipalities. So I'm gonna start with yourself, Rapelane.
Thank you so much. I don't know if I'm audible.
You are.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. Indeed, there have been very many questions pertaining to capacity. And really some of the questions are pertaining to our own experience working with municipalities. And I'll just start with the last one from my colleague from Nkangala. About the recent, capacity building exercise we've been doing, providing technical support to municipalities to start to respond to the requirements of the Climate Change Act by way of developing climate action plans. So I think it was a pilot phase. It was quite exciting for us to see, the challenges in municipalities. And what should be done going forward if we are to get municipalities on board. And one of the biggest challenge in municipalities is that because climate change has not been it has been an unfunded mandate,
sure.
Right? So because of that, there are no structures in place. So in many municipalities, you don't really have institutional arrangements that are responding to for example, adaptation. You've got one person who would be dealing with, for example, I'll say disaster, and that person deals with everything
sure.
In the municipality. And what that person does is just to respond to the core functions on a day-to-day basis, but it's just visually impossible for that person alone to do a lot that is required sure. for the municipalities to be able to move and perform their functions. So that has to be looked at. The institutional arrangements have to be looked at so that that can be addressed going forward. The issue of data, we spoke about it a lot here. I mean, there have been a lot of participants who spoke about data. It's a critical aspect because for us, I mean, as Salga, we are moving towards being a data-driven organization.
Sure.
And mainly because if you are data-driven, you are able to be, efficient. You are able to avoid, duplication of efforts.
Sure.
And the interventions that you put in place are targeted. And this is quite critical because if you are looking at disasters, you are looking at, having risks and vulnerabilities assessments in place. And when you have that, you are able to then be able to say, where do you point your interventions on? Your biggest value for money, where do you go? Other than just unguidedly trying to solve problems all over the place without that guidance that is evidence-based. So that is the experience that we got. We need to ensure that municipalities do access data.
Sure.
The technical skills, those have to be built for municipalities themselves to take ownership of most of these programs, because what has been happening in most instances, you'd find that consultants will come on board, they will develop a strategy, or whether it's a plan or it's an action. When they're gone, there is no skills transfer, and there's no one who owns the process. So what we are trying to do as SALGA is that we're trying to ensure that we handhold municipalities to the best way possible, and then they are able to, do their work and be able to defend their plans going forward for funding, and even able to deliberate and get financial support going forward. So that is one. The other area that was talked about was, the issue of climate change, that this is a field that is still new to many people, more especially communities, which is quite true. And that is why as SALGA, we make sure that, when there is a new administration in place, more especially in terms of councillors, we have councillor induction. So we don't only, capacitate officials, but we also capacitate political leaders, so that when they are taking those decisions, they are taking decisions that they understand and they are well informed about them. So that includes the issue of just transition, where we are having dialogues in all 9 provinces, really starting to socialize and localize just transition for the understanding of the communities on the ground, and also critical stakeholders like your civil society, NGOs, and all other stakeholders that we are working with. But more, we are saying, we are continuing to do climate change 101 for people to understand what is it that we're supposed to do. In terms of the hosting of this particular fund, I think for us it's more about efficiency. I've talked about this already. It's about efficiency. It's about ensuring that there is a clear criteria in place that would ensure that there is access. Municipalities require access as quickly as possible when there's a disaster in place. And beyond that, we need to also provide funding for disaster risk reduction. That's quite critical. I mean, we don't have to be reactive. In most cases, we have to also be proactive. That would ensure strengthening the early warning systems that are not there, and really also build awareness, create awareness with communities on the ground. What happens when there is disaster? Because in other countries, there is protocols that is already well known as to when there's a disaster, this is what we do, and everyone knows about it. And we need to start to move towards that. And there were many questions. I'm not gonna, yes, I'm not going to dwell on all of them. I've talked about the data issue. There was a question from Yuri about the systemic and structural issues at local government, and I think that's an important question to really deal with. We are looking at capacity building and training as a way to deal with some of the systemic issues that are there in municipalities. But we know that that is not enough. What is important is to ensure that we integrate climate risks into urban planning and also service delivery. So we're saying we need to deliver services in a sustainable manner. We need to ensure that as we have our tools, budgeting tools, those are well informed by data, and we need to mainstream climate change in those decision-making tools, because that would assist so that we don't have to perpetuate, building infrastructure in a place that we know is risky. And the risk and vulnerability assessment has already shown that that place would easily be flooded. Then that leads to losses and damages. It has to then be dealt with. So that's what we are dealing with. And I've talked already a lot about the institutional capacity and the opportunity also that Climate Change Act brings to ensure that we strengthen the institutional arrangements at municipal level so that we can be able to deal with some of these systemic and structural issues in the municipalities. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I know that was a tough task for you. There was a lot of questions that were directed to you, but again, it helps us to further unpack our thinking in terms of the proposal. So Stuart, you're not going to go through everything. Maybe answer the question around what is this fund not?
Thanks very much, and thank you, colleagues, for all the mostly very constructive comments and suggestions. We really, really appreciate that as the team. who's looking at developing this fund and taking it to the next stage, or being part of the team. So I've been taking, as Lebogang said, I've been taking lots of notes here electronically. I've sent them to myself already, so I've saved them. And before I get to that question, I would like to just touch on a couple of key issues. And thank you, Rabelani, for taking most of them. The G20 issue, I think that's a very key comment that was made. The President has really said that this is a very important thing that South Africa is going to be doing, heading the G20 or being the President of the G20 from December this year up until December next year. As you can imagine, it's an opportunity that comes around probably once in our lifetimes. And we need to make the most of it. We need to leverage, like we did for the FIFA 2010 World Cup. It's kind of at that scale that we're looking at. That's what the President has indicated. Government ministers are in IMC, which is an interministerial committee, on how best to take the G20 presidency forward. As you know, there's a finance and a Sherpa track. There's a number of meetings, something like 130 or something being planned, ministerial tracks, including one, by the way, on climate sustainability and environment. So that working group will be hosting as well as a ministerial. And the issue of climate finance has been identified as, I think someone said earlier, that Minister George has indicated that that's a very high priority. So you can see that there are already linkages. The other linkage, of course, is maybe that wasn't raised, is what's going to be happening at COP29 at Baku this year, actually next month. There's going to be huge discussions and hopefully an outcome or a decision on what the new collective quantified goal on finance, climate finance, should be. We've all heard about the $100 billion US that was agreed upon at Copenhagen in 2009. I think only recently the world managed to achieve the flow of $100 billion US from developed countries to developing countries for climate finance. What is $100 billion US as a percentage of the global GDP? 0.1%. We struggled to get to 0.1% in 15 years. It's frightening, actually. And this is a crisis that we've all agreed, as many speakers have mentioned here. So we really are looking at a quantum, an order of magnitude, and a completely different model to come out, because clearly this developing countries, developed countries type of divide has not really solved the problem. I know that's not the only source of international climate finance that we've been talking about. There are bilateral sources of funds that have been flowing, and there are other forms of private investment. We really are encouraged by the suggestions around the triple PPP mechanism. Thank you for that suggestion. I think it's something we really need to pursue and look into a bit further. And I'm glad our colleagues from National Treasury are also on board in that regard. And getting the community involvement and representation in how this fund works, how the disbursement happens, is really important. The data analysis, I think Ravalani's touched on that in his response. It's an important issue. It has been recognized. And then just to conclude, I know I haven't got to your question, facilitator, but I wanted to make this comment. As of March 2022, according to Dr. Google, the market capitalization of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, is there any idea what that is? You can also look it up. I promise you I'm not inventing this. 1.36 trillion US dollars is the market capitalization as of 2.5 years ago. Just down the road at the JSE. What is that in rands? We're looking at times that by about 17.5. You're looking at about 24 trillion rands in the JSE. So when we talk about mobilizing private sector, guys, I don't think we've even scratched the surface. I mean, if you mobilize 1% of that, you're looking at 240 billion rand into climate change, just 1%. How do we do it is the question. That's what I want to leave the audience with. I don't think we're able to say what this fund is not.
Sure.
Let's talk more about what this fund could possibly do.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Commissioner Lekalakala, you're going to have to be even more brief and succinct. Issues related to community participation, how do we strengthen this for this fund?
Okay, thank you very much. I think there was some comments that I thought I may be able to respond to. I think maybe just to say that I'm one of the climate commissioners, but I'm also from civil society, and in particular, I work mostly with grassroots communities. So that's why sometimes I feel that I have an authority to amplify the grassroots communities' voices, particularly poor people who are affected by some of the issues that we're talking about. So that presence is there, and I know that there's a presence online of grassroots communities that have joined this discussion, that also have been part of developing inputs and also critiquing some of the suggestions that are coming forward. The language, it's something that is very difficult. But however, I think with us who are working on the ground, we somehow have found a way on how to do that. Obviously, each and every institution is different on its approach. I can share the approach that the sector that I work with has. The approach is that we take people's experiences and the people will tell us what's happening, and then we link it up to the bigger issues, to the bigger concepts. Sometimes it's not, we don't even talk about climate, we don't say climate change because there's no word that equates climate change mostly in the indigenous languages, but how you explain or what people are experiencing, that will tell you that then they understand that the weather patterns have been changing over quite a lot of time. But most of the time we get information from the people themselves who tell you that the weather patterns are changing, but they will explain it in a particular way to say, we know that after 5 years, there's going to be a change in weather patterns. It may be extreme because this has been happening, over a period of time, and that mostly is derived from the indigenous knowledge systems, how information is being passed and how people digest it, and also try to improve the situation or adapt to the changing situation that they find themselves in. So the language of decarbonization, the language of climate change, some of the terminology that we have, it's not something that we would always put up front, but now at least we've got the Gen Zs who are very quick and have adapted to the language, but the Gen Zs also are learning from the elder generation as to what has been happening, and they can be able to translate that to the kind of the current language that is being used. But this is something that maybe some other communicators can be able to say, how do we do that? But luckily now we have your apps, media apps that are also assisting a lot. In many times we discuss and we share information and we learn from the people in our own indigenous language, and that helps, and that's how a greater awareness on climate change has been made. And also with the fund after having been developed, or after the whole conceptualization of the fund, and when it's like finalized, there will be a need for greater awareness. And I think we can take the learnings from all the other issues that we are aware of as to how do we make that, how do we make it simple for people to be able to access the funding itself.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Kulisa, there was a lot that was directed to you, and I'm requesting that you don't respond to all of it, because National Treasury has the responsibility of, after this conceptualization, to institutionalize, to practicalize, this particular fund. So there's no, please don't respond to everything, is what I'm asking. So if you could maybe pick on a couple of comments that you maybe want to reflect on, and then the rest, like I said, is really how we actually operationalize this fund.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the comments and questions. I'd like to really touch on a particular question that was asked about the growing debt that we have and how we're going to manage that with these funds and all these things that are coming from international donors. Is that, first and foremost, this transition and climate change is happening at a time when our country is very fragile economically. And we are very aware of that as National Treasury. But the very first thing is our fiscal consolidation strategy. In whatever it is that we do, however nice it sounds, the very core thing that will drive is our fiscal consolidation strategy, that's aimed at curtailing the amount of debt that we have on our stock. So it's not just because we're saying these big numbers that practically we're going to absorb all those big numbers immediately. We're going to do it in a very sustainable way. So I just wanted to make that very clear. So in terms of the red tapes to access funding, at municipal level, I'm assuming Mr. Paku, we haven't seen that as yet. We don't think it's the legislation that stops them from accessing funding. It's their financial management. Because obviously creditors, banks, look at your financial status and they say, are you credible or not? That's what's stopping them from accessing funding, because those that have accessed funding, either from DFIs, commercial banks, pension funds, whatever the case may be, access those funding easily through the back of their credit worthiness. So we don't see at this point in time the accessing of funding is really the barrier at this point in time, but it's really the management of municipalities that's the barrier to the access of funding. To answer Kwesi's question, and I'm happy she's back, on the climate budget tagging, look, we had phase 2, where the frameworks are currently being piloted at Department of Water, Transport, and DFFE. So that's where they are in terms of the climate budget tagging process. With regards to the review of the conditional grants and the review of the free basic services component of the equitable share, just a quick answer to your question is that, or to your comment, is that we are reviewing, in conjunction with reviewing conditional grants, we are reviewing the entire local government fiscal framework. So making things like, how do we make free basic services more accessible and more targeted to indigent households? So those are the things that we are currently looking at in totality. In terms of National Treasury having a bigger voice in terms of climate change, I think that will change going into the future. I mean, we had the climate change symposium in July, which I think for National Treasury was a very, very good platform for us to have a common sense of what is needed to address climate change. And from now going forward, I think you'll hear more common voice on climate change issues coming from National Treasury, starting with the MTBPS coming up in 2 weeks or something like that. So that's where you hear a lot of what we are doing as National Treasury in addressing climate change. So yeah, the rest of comments, the triple P mechanism, I think Stuart addressed that. Yeah. So yeah, I won't go into that.
Thank you very much. In the spirit of inclusivity and procedural justice, I must recognize the people that are online, and we will run a little bit over time. Please bear with us. This is what consultations come with. I believe there's 3 hands online, Mandy. If you could just please cue them in, because I can't see who is online. So who's the first person that wants to speak? And our request is please introduce yourself, be to the point, and indicate who you're directing your question to, or if it's a comment, just also tell us that. Who's the first person, Mandy?
Start with Clement.
Okay, Clement, please make your point.
Okay. Good afternoon, good morning. Am I audible enough?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Well, my question is from from PCC, because you know the terms that you use on to explain to the communities is very deep, and a lot of things you just make it. I think maybe they say you must make quick. You know, the process is quick. It's unfair for the civil society and the community that everything that you come with is already done. And then I'm crying again on the funding model. The funding model always it shows that the disaster response is there, the livelihoods, loss and damage, build back better, adaptation future proofing, and mitigation future proofing. It's for long term. And then I think we have to review this, because loss and damage it's a long term thing. It happens on the short term, but it's a long term. But even the investors which are there, it's unfair. The ring fence finance that you sponsor the fund with, you have to make it transparent, and we have to have a list of all the people who pop up the money on this fund, because we don't want to become interested about getting funding without knowing who is funding us. Because I can see that on this adaptation and mitigation, people from overseas is them who get the big chunk. There's no local funder who is involved here. We have to consider that we need to also consider our local funders. And lastly, I want to say the municipalities and the household, which means they are different people, municipalities and household and business. Now you have to make the scale for the communities, because the household is them who suffer big time on these disasters, and it's them who knows the effects of these disasters. Even now, other communities, they don't know. Municipalities don't tell the communities what to do when there's a disaster. I think they keep the money for their municipal debts or what, but we have to change the system. And lastly, the Climate Change Act is our tool on all these things, on responses, on, if you read it well, on chapter 2, section 7.1 and 2. It says all the departments, organs of state must change all their policies and laws, so that Department of Forest and they must not say, no, me, I'm dealing with this, and because we're dealing with the pandemic of climate change. Please, let's make sure that the president must put it into effect, so that the PCC also must be impartial and independent to make their mandate to be heard, because the communities are suffering and the effects of climate change is being felt. Even you see last the snow, people nearly died, people nearly suffered. It's a trauma to all South Africans. We have to be quick. We don't have to just always talk. We have to act. The action time is now. Thank you very much. From the grassroots level for climate action. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Clement. The next person, Mandy, who raised their hand.
I think we can take Honey.
Okay, Honey, if you could come in, introduce yourself and direct your question to a particular panelist.
Am I audible, Chair? You can
Yes,
hear
you
me?
are. Yes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this very rich conversation. I'm hoping it goes beyond dialogue. My name is Hani Mamabolo, a change architect and sustainability strategist. I'm the CEO of CIV Africa Group, which is an integrated sustainability business consulting. Now, Chair, as I'm listening through, and I'm going to touch on 3 points, mine is a comment, is in South Africa, I think we need to look back. Richard Worthington mentioned earlier around 2008. We've been able to implement stuff in this country, and I've had the pleasure of being involved in policy implementation, development finance, private public partnerships in the area of renewable energy or energy market transformation. The same approach can be adopted here. You know, that what we need is around policy certainty. You mentioned earlier, you think we are on the right track. We now have a climate change policy. We are now talking of funding mechanisms. I think what is critical, and that's where we fall flat as a country, is around governance and institutional frameworks. We need to strengthen our intergovernmental coordination, stakeholder engagement, and we've got learnings in other countries. You know, Germany recently made it legally binding for cities to implement climate risk assessments and implementation measures around climate adaptation and climate response. I live in KZN, the brunt of all this. So that's a one point around the governance and institutional framework. Someone mentioned earlier that I think we don't have a challenge around funding. It's about what is it that we are funding, and as the opening keynote mentioned, what will this focus on? I think it's very important that this is focused on critical infrastructure for climate resilience, around green economy initiatives, and mostly our next energy crisis is water. We've known for a while as a country, but we've done very little. So we need to make sure that some of this funding, because someone asked a question, what is the focus? That didn't come through. I think it would be important that that is clearly articulated. And the last one that I want to it's actually four. The third one is around community and making sure that we leave no one behind. I think nothing should be happening for communities without communities. But accept that our municipalities who drive service delivery are actually very not ready. So they need to be capacitated right with the right skills to manage funds and delivery. The last one then is around monitoring and evaluation. I think it is important that ultimately when all is said and done, we are sure that whatever funding mechanism that will be pooled with private sector or other countries' governmental institutions, they are used correctly and we track, and as a country, we can show. We were silent on the NDP. It's 6 years to the NDP targets. And economically and otherwise, we are far from what we set out. Thanks once again, and it's a privilege to be in this discussion.
Thank you very much. That was really helpful comments for us. The next person, Mandy, is?
I think we got Zandile. You can.
Zandile, if you could come and introduce yourself and direct your question or comment.
Good day, everyone, and thank you, Chair, for recognizing us. My name is Zandi Dipulu. I'm a UP master student, and I'm representing Urban Farm Technology. I'm based in KZN, so the project that we are doing is actually teaching the community about the climate change. So my question is based on how to ensure that we promote the inclusion on climate change education from basic education, because I've heard from the discussion that we have a huge issue when it comes to the language barrier. In rural areas, most of our people, they don't even know what is climate change. So how do we ensure that students from a young age are equipped with the knowledge and skills to contribute to the adaptation efforts of these plans, to collaborate with the Department of Education? And when you see from international, we've got the Commonwealth, which is COP29, which is taking place next week. When we look at South Africa, there's less youth that are involved in this initiative. So how do we ensure that we emphasize the involvement of the youth as young as possible? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandile. The next person, Mandy, is it Rob?
Yeah, thanks.
All right, Rob, we'll go with you.
Thanks, Chair. Rob Adam, representing the Industrial Development Corporation today. Where I'm going with my question is the focus of the fund. I mean, Desigan introduced this right in the very beginning. And what I'm missing here, and it's probably embedded in the various documents and policies which have been collected over the last couple of years, is there a proper SWOT analysis anywhere with respect to South Africa's adaptation to climate change? What I've been hearing, from various interventions is this is almost a response to extreme weather events fund. rather than something which looks at the much broader picture. For example, agriculture, employment. It's a threat, climate change, to employment in Mpumalanga, but an opportunity in the Northern Cape. So what I'm missing is a kind of a bigger picture understanding of all of the ramifications. I'm being a little sarcastic here, but are we going to have to move wine farming in the Western Cape to Marion Island, as Cape Town becomes the new Lüderitz? So, yeah, what I'm needing, I think, is an understanding of what country we're going to see, assuming that climate change in its full horror of maybe 3 degrees or so happens over the next 30, 40 years. It's different for different countries. I mean, net zero itself is a threat to various countries in Africa. And what's net zero going to do to Nigeria when it can't sell oil? Algeria, Angola. So there are different, each region has its own challenges. And so I guess what I'm looking for is some guidance on what the fund's approach would be with respect to that question. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Rob, for that. Raymond, we're going to move over to you. If you could ask your question and direct it to a specific panelist. Raymond, can you hear us? Raymond, if you're struggling, I'm going to move to Motlatsi while you're figuring out the audio there. Motlatsi, if you can come in with your question and direct it to a specific panelist, please.
Good day, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. If you can hear me, please indicate.
Sure.
Yes, look, mine is more of a comment on what can the fund do. Richard, I'm glad to see him there. I'm also a member of the Climate Justice Coalition. And my goal for the year has been integrating climate change into the integrated development plan of the municipality. We've had this conversation with Richard, and I'm glad that he also mentioned it. And that's what I think, or I believe that the fund should fund a policy design and development of a climate policy action within municipality, and using this integrated development plan, because I want to believe that alleviate the whole of challenges that we're talking about, where we're talking about skills transfer when you have your consultant developing some of these instruments and tools, and then leaving without anybody having some sort of like a mandate on the document itself, or even understanding. I'm also have attended quite a number of IDP managers forum where I witnessed that the bigger picture or the bigger challenge is the political will. If you can look around the room, you will notice that there isn't that many municipalities, meaning that the people that we are talking about regarding these funds are not in the room today. So we are not talking about the people that are present here today, which will help us, when you talk about your intergovernmental relations, where these instruments are help sort of like align with other sector departments. I would like to end there, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those comments. We really appreciate them. I just want to check, Raymond, are you still unable to sort out your audio? Can you say something?
Am I audible, Chair?
Yes, you are. Thank you. And you're the last person, and then we're gonna.
All right. Chair, as you know that we from the Northern Cape are actually impacted negatively because of the effects of Botswana, Namibia, which are the neighboring countries sharing the border with our country. We are experiencing extreme heat waves, high temperatures, which are affecting farming processes. And knowing that the population of Northern Cape is not as compared to the ones, we have a vast land parcel, but with a lower population. And therefore, disaster responses sometimes it depends on the type of population that a particular area has. And now we are challenged because we have a vast land which is negatively and heavily affected. And due to the issues of population challenges, there are no funding that can be directed to the province in a form of a disaster to ensure that our issues are actually addressed in the province. The other issue is the Kimberley mining activities, which have already ceased due to the reduction of diamonds. But in all fairness, cities that contribute to the GDP of the country must also be prioritized, not because of they have a lower population number. They must also be prioritized in terms of ensuring that what they produce in our GDP. For instance, in Kurman, we have Kumba mines, which are also contributing majorly in the economy of the country. But nothing is actually given back to the province to ensure that the province is able to address the issues of mitigation and also adaptation in terms of climate change. The weather is actually extremely high, and we've seen that we've reached 40 degrees last year. And I'm now wondering this year what is going to happen, because 2 weeks back, I believe we had now incidents where now the wind patterns are now increasing, and therefore veld fires are also going to be a threat to the farmers, whom are actually now trying to ensure that they survive in these extreme weather patterns. And therefore, we also would like the Presidential Climate Change Commission to support SALGA to ensure that local municipalities have the capacity that is needed to ensure that when such incidents reoccur, at least adaptation has already been put in place. Because if adaptation is not in place, then it means we are going to head for a disaster in this province. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Raymond, and thank you to the colleagues online for being patient with us. I just want to check if there are any takers for response. We don't all have to respond, but if there are any takers, we'll go with you, and then we can quickly take responses. Sure, let's start. Let's start with the DFFE perspective, because I did hear a couple of things that are actually up your lane, Stuart.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm glad these were mostly comments once again. I have been taking notes. This has enriched some of the perspectives that have been provided throughout the year, actually, while we've been working on developing this fund. The issue of climate change in the curriculum, I think it's a very, very important issue. We've long been aware that climate change has got intergenerational implications. So teaching our kids about it, not in the way of them being traumatized, because I heard that in some countries, young children are being traumatized by climate change and the fear of it. So there's a psychological element that needs to be managed. But we do need to find a way to get that into the curriculum. On the M&E, I think that's been covered. The green economy has also been mentioned in the Climate Change Act as one of the responses as part of the transition, the just transition and the transformation of our economy. So that's an important element. The NDP targets is a concern. I think we all are concerned about not meeting those, as with the Sustainable Development Goals, whether we will, as a country, meet them by 2030. The issue that was raised around the SWOT analysis, the rationale, the focus of the CCRF, and the adaptation elements, particularly related to agriculture, is an important issue. And I would advise that we all take time to get hold of the State of Climate Action report, which was released by the PCC, was it July this year? In that report, you will get all the context about where we are in terms of adaptation, what are the priorities, where are the strengths, where are the weaknesses, where are the opportunities. and read that in conjunction with the Climate Change Act, because the two go hand in hand. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Stuart. I saw, Rabelani, you wanted to respond to? Oh, you're fine. Okay, thank you. Are there any other responses from colleagues? Okay, then thank you very much to panelists. Thank you very much to the robust engagement in the room. I didn't expect it. And thank you to the audience online. I think lesson learned. We should have a whole day session for this, because clearly there are so many views, valid views, by the way, and something for us to think about as we further build up on this report and develop those important recommendations. So a round of applause for our panelists, please. Thank you, colleagues, and a round of applause for you for your participation. I think this was an absolutely amazing session. Okay, so now my boss is on the screen, so we have to turn our attention to him now. Welcome, Edie. The Executive Director will do some reflections, wrap up for us, and give us some way forward in terms of process. So over to you, Edie.
Thank you, Chair. And I must say a really great thank you to all of our participants today. I mean, we've had an absolutely excellent set of inputs, and I'm certainly not going to repeat everything that you've said. I mean, maybe at the outset, just to make clear that, ultimately the decision around this fund is going to lie in the hands of DFFE, National Treasury, and Cabinet itself. So, the role that we're playing as the PCC is to, bring broad stakeholders into the conversation, and we will make recommendations to the Minister of DFFE to consider. That's, I think, the first point to emphasize. I do agree with the points that have been made about adaptation. Adaptation has been underemphasized. We've underemphasized it domestically, and that's part of a global problem. I mean, there's a global underemphasis in terms of both funding and action. I think Stuart said at the beginning, we need scaled up finance that's fit for purpose. We can add to that, we need to look at the full financing stack that goes into adaptation finance. So public and private money, local and global, the role of grants, of concessional lending, of commercial debt, and equity in grappling with the adaptation problem. And we are, in a new era. I mean, again, Stuart mentioned this focus on creating a new class of assets. And we need to think of these assets as resilience assets that are going to strengthen our food security, our water security, our basic services, and ultimately community resilience. I do want to agree with the point all of you have raised about the importance of the Climate Change Act. I mean, that really sets the legal framework for action around climate change. And whatever we do with this fund needs to rally behind and support the implementation of that legislation. And you've highlighted in this discussion, in a sense, the two poles of focus of this fund. So, the one focus is on building long-term resilience and all the hard work that's got to go into this gritty bottom-up community resilience that we want to build. The other is strengthening our disaster response. And that, includes issues such as loss and damage, and these slow onset disasters. That was one of the points raised in the chat. We need to be thinking also not just about immediate extreme weather events, but also some of the things that we tend not to focus on around slower onset, sometimes less prominent and less tracked kinds of effects. So you've put a set of principles on the table that I think we are largely agreed with. We want a mechanism that's responsive. We want it to be quick. We are going to follow an incremental approach. So we're not going to try this big bang approach and do everything initially. Let's start with something fairly limited and achievable and then scale it up. In doing that, we want to build confidence. We want to marshal all of the different stakeholders and bring them in. We want to be transparent about it. And a couple of you have floated this notion of a bottom-up approach. And, I guess we should put that at the center of the way that we think about this. So we want to be thinking about, the impact on households, on communities, on the local authorities that, do a lot of the basic services in support of them, on the local businesses and enterprises, and then more broadly, district and provincial level. So we need to think about this fund in a bottom-up way, starting with people on the ground. And the other important principle that, a number of you have mentioned is not to duplicate what already exists. And I was really struck by the Treasury input around the work they've been doing on disaster risk financing. So, they've made some bold proposals, which I really want to encourage you all to read, on, strengthening public insurance, this idea of parametric insurance, also how to strengthen the conditional grant system, and the broader budget tagging that they're doing, which will ultimately help us track the way that the whole public finance spread gets mobilized around climate stuff. So, to me, it's very clear that this climate change response fund should not try and be a duplication of the public MTEF budget or the conditional grant system. Those systems are important. They may be underfunded at the moment. We've heard loud and clear the message from local government that you're at the coalface of these things and you're not getting the financial support to do it. But I don't think this fund is able to solve the underfunding of local government as the primary problem. And I think we've got to articulate it clearly in separation to the government budget and the MTF and the conditional grant system. So that to me is the one big challenge, which I think still has to be thought through in making the recommendations. The other big challenge is how to, a couple of people spoke about this, how to get the investors in the room. And when the president announced this fund in the State of the Nation address, he said very clearly, I want this to be done in partnership with the private sector. The private sector itself has been, unengaged in the adaptation space or not sufficiently engaged. We heard a lot of stuff that the Treasury is doing to enable that private sector participation. So, we need to note and applaud the work they've done on the green finance taxonomy, the green bonds, the de-risking, the blended finance instruments, the grants they've done for infrastructure, the PPP regulations they're doing. I mean, all of that is very important. But I think we've got to think long and hard about what is the business proposition to the private sector for investing in this fund. And, how does that get backed up by the right enabling framework to bring them in at the required scale? Because, we're dealing with a fairly limited pool of grant finance. And we're not going to be able to meet the adaptation challenge just on the grants that are on the table. So to me, that's the other big conceptual challenge that the PCC needs to think about in formulating its recommendations on this. And then, you know, we need to obviously give some thought about the implementation modalities. And I must say, I've been quite struck by some of the really groundbreaking work that's been done on impact investing. So, I mean, that's a very interesting new area of development. And then also some of these funds that have been set up that are outcomes-based, where the grants are made basically against outcomes that have been achieved. And I do think an outcomes-based model could provide some very innovative implementation solutions. Maybe a last word when I conclude, Chair. You know, Clement made the point that the time for action is now. And I do think we need to seize this moment with some urgency and you know, finalize our recommendations and encourage government to get a move on with this fund. Because I think the demand out there, I mean, as we've heard today in this discussion, is enormous. The need is great. We face a looming climate disaster, and it behoves us to get in place the mechanisms to ultimately, you know, help communities adapt and respond and build their own resilience. So I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank the PCC team for all the hard work they've done. And thank you, Chair, for ably facilitating this meeting.